Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Mehrsa Baradaran, Professor of Law at the University of Georgia School of Law, and we will discuss her book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, which was recently published by Harvard University Press. So welcome to the program.
Thanks
Mehrsa.
for having me, Brian. This
Oh,
is
the
great.
pleasure's all mine. You know,
Yeah.
it's great to see you again,
Likewise.
and so fun to talk to one of my former law school classmates.
Totally.
So
way back.
Yeah, so your book obviously is fantastic and has
Thank
been
you.
incredibly successful for obvious reasons. But I'm really looking forward to talking to you about it. I was wondering if maybe we could start by framing your project in relation to what seems to me kind of like a misperception about the nature of black banking, quote unquote, black capitalism, and kind of the nature of the problem at stake. Because it seems like you're bringing a really corrective sort of viewpoint to this issue. And so I was wondering if you could just kind of share what the conventional wisdom was and what, you know, as a way of providing a prelude for your intervention.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, let me just talk about a recent event. So Trump just released this program called Opportunity Zones, and you've got, you know, people like Cory Booker out there saying like, oh, well, these opportunity zones, these, you know, and I'm going to call them black ghettos because ghetto, I think, is more of an appropriate word here, right? Because they were not built voluntarily. They were, you know, places of segregation. So the idea, so Cory Booker says these are domestic emerging markets, and we're going to have investments, and it's going to be a win-win. And so the idea is what these sectors and what the black population needs is, you know, banks and entrepreneurship and investment and all of this stuff, right? That it is lack of that sort of, you know, capitalism to sort of flourish there, and that's just not right, right? So that's not the myth, the central myth that my book, you know, gets to, but it is one that emerged out of some of the things that sort of happened post Nixon, right? So I think one of the central myths is that that banks or businesses or the creation of black banks or businesses can remedy these problems, and the assumption is that, well, you know, white banks or white businesses are discriminating, right? So if they weren't discriminating, then we could, you know, have a flourishing economy. But what I try to show is just the structural aspects of that inequality and how you can throw in black banks and businesses, you can throw in investors, but unless you fundamentally change the way capital accrues unto itself, then you're not going to change that systemic inequality.
Yeah. So the book really takes on a huge chunk of history.
Right.
I mean, you start essentially more or less with the end of the Civil War.
Yes, 1865.
And
yeah.
bring the book
Right.
all the way up to the present. And you know, one thing that really struck me about the story you tell is how it seemed like the same story happening over and over again in different periods of American history. This consistent effort by the African American community to engage with economic wealth generation, consistently being frustrated, and the variety seemed to be in all the different ways that white America came up with to frustrate black entrepreneurialism.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, and I don't want to pretend like there's all these villains that are all the same and it's like the same book. The problem is that we have this racial sort of class divide, right? So black labor has always been sort of endemic to the system that we've created. And I won't call it capitalism because I don't think it's quite capitalism, right? Jim Crow is not capitalism. Neither is segregation. Those are state interventions. But what the myth of sort of American racial hierarchy has been is that, the browner you are, the more you should be labor. And the whiter you are, the more you should be capital, right? I mean, that kind of like mapped out at some points it was spelled out directly, and at others it was just sort of like, this is the way things are, and so it just gets fixed in the brain. So I think for the Black population to break out, it has required a lot of sort of changing of those norms, and we just haven't yet to do that. And so that's why the story repeats, right? So I tell the story of the Freedmans Bank, right? So there are these pivotal moments where you think that something could happen, and there have only been two, I think. One being the post-Civil War, so Reconstruction era, and the other being post-Civil Rights, where you really have this focus on this harsh injustice. And for a variety of reasons, like the nation focuses on this, right? So Civil War, obviously, a lot of different things come to the fore, and we have this, period of Reconstruction where it's like, okay, how do we make this right? So land was on the table, but land was never going to be possible, and to keep the Southern sort of like, economy in place. And so land was off the table. And then, so instead of land, you get this savings bank. And I think that was, it's something that people don't quite talk about, the Freedman Savings Bank. But it's this dramatic failure. I mean, it's sort of, something that both the reformers want, and the South is just, it's fine, right? It's not a big deal. And it fails because, the capital from the slaves comes into it, and the sort of, it gets speculated away in the stock market. And then you have post-civil rights. You've got these two strands of the civil rights movement. You've got, Black nationalists. You have, Martin Luther King's coalition, and both are pushing for specifically economic agendas. One being like populist, sort of poor people's movement. The other being just reparations and autonomy, sort of along the lines of like anti-colonialism abroad. Neither is really accepted by 1968, and so you get Black capitalism. And so I think, yes, like history isn't exactly the same, but it does rhyme in a way. And so it is, you do have this, right, like avenues for meaningful reform that would have been costly being, subverted by this other thing that looks kind of like that thing, but is not quite.
Yeah. No, I think we should return to that theme in a moment. But one thing that really struck me about your book that I really liked, and that I felt like reflected sort of the special value you brought to the subject as someone with a finance and corporate law background, is that it felt like in some ways you were using like Black banks and Black banking as a metaphor for Black engagement with and Black entrepreneurialism and efforts to develop the economic health of the Black community. But at the same time, you also have, I think, a really kind of sophisticated read on why it was that these banks structurally were incapable of succeeding, both because of discrimination and segregation, but also because of kind of fundamental aspects of capital formation and their sort of role in the economy in relation to other banks. And I know that's kind of a big question, but maybe you can touch on that a little bit, because I think it's just really fascinating.
Thank you. Well, I'll say one thing. It's I always can tell that as someone who is interviewing me hasn't read the book when they say something like, well, tell me about Black banks. And it's like, the book is not about Black, right? So like, and so you can, and I don't mean it as like I'm trying to hide the ball, but like you said, I'm using Black banks more as like a mirror, because I think what banking in general, but specifically Black banking shows is banks are like, they're like the movers of capital, right? They're neither, I get frustrated by people like, oh, the greedy bankers. They're not any more greedy than the rest of us, right? Like banks are a system that reflects, right, the broader economy. And yes, by allowing them to get certain ways, we create a different kind of system. And we can talk about, how Hamilton would have wanted it in Jefferson, but it's not the banks. The banks don't matter here. I don't care about the banks. It's what the banks show about the economy. So what these banks have shown, I mean, there's a couple things, right? One is that Look, in order to have wealth creation, you need capital to begin with, right? And banks know that. And you're right, every banker understands that you have to have, if you're going to serve the needs of the community, if you're going to create wealth, you need some wealth to begin with, right? You need some sort of collateral or whatever. And what you have in these communities is on, the asset side of the balance sheet and on the liability side of the black banks, both sides are sort of drawn down by the specific nature of poverty that they're trying to alleviate. So the very thing that they're trying to remedy is the thing that impedes their ability to do it, right? So you've got assets, sort of like home loans, right? For most of history, unfortunately, until today, home values in black neighborhoods don't appreciate over time. So once a neighborhood tips into being not just majority black, even like over like a 10% threshold, those homes are not desirable to the broader market, and so they're not appreciating in value. So those are bank assets, those are loans. On the liability side are the deposits, right? And so banks need a lot of big deposits that are going to stay there in order to lend them, right? That's less risk, less overhead, especially in past eras, but even today, that's why banks don't give small accounts. Like, they don't want your $2,000, right? So this is my particular frustration with this like bank black movement. Hey, everyone, send your $10 to the banks. And I asked the black bankers, I'm like, what are you doing with these deposits? They're like, well, we're dealing with it, but so the liabilities are, too small, too volatile, and the assets are not appreciating. And so that's a toxic mix for a bank. And so you can take deposits from blacks and you can lend to blacks, but there's no way you can grow that wealth in that community if you're not sort of embedded in that larger system, right? So the way that banks create money is through that lending and then it coming back, but it has to come back in. And so if you've got a segregated economy, that money is always going to flow toward where the other money is, right? Money is like, there's this principle in chemistry, forget, organic chemistry was my favorite class in college, and there's a couple of things that I remembered, and one is like carbons. Anyway, so carbon, do you ever take organic chem? No. Basically like likes like, right? So, like, this is why we've had unit banking for most of history, is that Jefferson and the populace understood that if you let the money go wherever, it's always going to go to Wall Street, right? And so they forced it to not. So if you're going to have a bank in Lexington, Kentucky, that's it. That's the only bank you get. You don't get to have a branch in Wall Street and shoot the money there, because they knew that Lexington would then not have a bank, right? And that's what's happening essentially.
Yeah, and one of the things that was interesting, sort of in the story that you tell of all of these efforts to create financially viable black banks, was how the different ways that kind of de facto and de jure segregation and discrimination were used to prevent the banks from having the kind of access to capital it seems like you would actually need for them to be successful, and even to really block them out of working in the first place. You talked about like banks being denied charters, and lacking access to credit.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And these kinds of, and I was like, wow, it never occurred to me like just how nuts and bolts the problems could be that would make it impossible.
Yeah, I mean, the chartering thing was fascinating, right? So I expected, so as I was doing this research, like, there's a couple banks in Chicago, and I expected there to be, look, what are the big centers, right? Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Harlem. And I expected that Harlem would have the most banks. That was the most concentrated black community. And as I started digging into this, I saw all these newspaper articles during that time of these bank charters being denied. I'm like, surely that can't be the whole story. But as I dug deeper, it looks like what was happening in Harlem. So Chicago had its banks, and Baltimore, and this is pre-Great Depression. Harlem kept trying to charter banks. There was a ton of interested parties because Harlem was a really profitable black population. What was happening was that Chase Manhattan had a bunch of bank branches uptown in Harlem, and what they were doing was taking deposits and lending them downtown. And I actually found a master's thesis from a Chase employee who worked in the Harlem branch saying essentially this. He was
I saw from like 1930
1930
or so.
something.
I even read the footnotes.
You do? I love it. Oh, you're the best reader. I was like, what is he saying? And so he's like, we don't lend because it's a risk, because the blacks don't know how to do business. I'm like, talk about like self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So they're taking the deposits uptown, taking them downtown. He's explaining exactly, like, he's like a woke banker, right? Because he's thinking that he's helping, right? But meanwhile, he's like giving up all the dirty laundry, right? So then I kind of looked around, and it looks like the Chase, was part of the New York Banking Commission that was giving out charters. And New York, every state has huge discretion. They don't have to tell you why. They can just say no charter. So that seems like what was happening. I can't prove it, but it looks like they were denying charters to these black banks. And so, there's this great Baldwin quote that I found after I wrote the book. But kind of, Baldwin grew up in Harlem, and he talks about Chase Manhattan. He talks about, white is a metaphor for power, and that's another way of describing Chase Manhattan Bank. And it doesn't make sense unless you sort of see this landscape. Like, Chase was like occupying Harlem, taking the deposits. And I don't know if Baldwin knew of the workings of Chase, but anyway, that was a fantastic quote that I did not get to include in the book, so I will just say it right here. The other thing was the clearinghouses, right? So in Chicago, Jesse Bingo was like this big black banker, the biggest, sort of best, most profitable black bank. And in the days pre-FDIC insurance, good bankers joined up in a clearinghouse. So a clearinghouse was like very sophisticated. You would it's like an insurance, right? So you would pay premiums. Only great banks got to be in it. And he joined the Chicago Clearinghouse, which was this great clearinghouse. And as his bank is failing during the Great Depression, he calls on the clearinghouse to back him up, and they say no. And it's not that they didn't save every other bank in that clearinghouse. They saved, and not Binga's. So there's all these ways in which, or just getting liquidity, right? If you have a run, pre-FDIC insurance, you just need buddies. You need a network to like come call in and just cover you for a little bit. And black banks didn't have enough. I mean, one of the interesting bankers, and I try to highlight her in the book. I think you can write a whole book about Maggie Walker. She's the first woman banker, period, and owns this bank in Richmond, and she covers for a bunch of banks. She merges several banks into hers during the Great Depression. She becomes the first African American conducted in the Virginia Bankers Association. She's just this like really savvy businesswoman. And what she does is provide liquidity to other black banks. And so she gives this speech like right before the Great Depression. She's like, look, like if there's like 15 big black bankers, like we have to be saving each other during these things. And so they were creating these networks, but it just wasn't enough. You really you need that capital if you're a bank to succeed.
Yeah. Well, and you tell a lot of really interesting, like, personality-driven and region-driven stories in the book. And
I could have told more. There's so many interesting stories. I feel like don't get wrapped up in this.
And one that really struck me was a sort of almost like a Tale of Two Cities story that you told about the relationship between Durham and
Tulsa. Yes.
Tulsa.
Yeah.
And the sort of the history of these early Black Wall Streets, which I really think has not gotten the attention it deserves. But I was wondering if you could kind of give people, because there's just so much bound up in that story about sort of entrepreneurialism, but also sort of the negotiation that African Americans had to do with bluntly racism.
Yeah, absolutely. So Durham is, so backing up, so Booker T. Washington has this theory that, the way toward equality is first you're going to be segregated and you don't need to change anything politically. What you need to do is accrue wealth, and wealth will get you respect. And he has this whole thing like if a black man has a mortgage on a white man's house, he's going to respect him, right? If a black man gets in the front car of the whatever train, like he's going to get respect, right? And that actually isn't what happens, right? If a black man has a mortgage on a white man's house, they're going to get the mob in those days, and they're going to do some violence, right? So this is what happens in Tulsa and as opposed to Durham. So Durham and Tulsa are the two in the South major capitals of black wealth, and there's several reasons, right? Tulsa blacks got there early on. There was some oil wealth that was shared equally. And so the black center of town, Greenwood, was tons of beautiful churches and businesses and lots of money. And it was central in the town. Then there was Durham, and same thing. There was like the tobacco industry. Everyone had jobs. It was just this thriving economy. And so the major black businesses were there. So you have mechanics and farmers, bank, you have the insurance fund, you've got paper manufacturing, socks, all sorts of industry run by blacks there. It's still, the basis of the black middle class. So Durham sort of, I guess, for some reason, they kind of decide to play along with the white power structure in a way that doesn't threaten anybody. So they make their buildings, they have essentially, they say this, like, we will not make our buildings larger than any of the other buildings, right? So they have small buildings. They don't take up like prime real estate. They're not flashy. They kind of get along, play along. And they say this, right? The mayor says, we all get along, we all play along. And so Durham is able to thrive. Tulsa, on the other hand, no. There's a lot of, ostentatious church buildings, and the black men. So it's a hub of the NAACP, and they're armed. Oh. So they all, exercise their Second Amendment rights and are sort of, just like powerful and not backing down from confrontation. So what happens in Tulsa is what happens everywhere in the South is, some girl allegedly gets, harassed by some boy, but obviously, that's the spark. But for months before, there was a slight recession, and there was a lot of black businesses that were getting these anonymous things on their doors, like, you better leave, right? So a lot of threats. And then that spark, so the black kid gets put in jail, and there's a white mob that comes around the jail, and then the armed black men in Tulsa come out to protect this kid. Someone fires a shot, and then it's just mayhem. So the city gets burned to the ground. And it's really, what's interesting, what we don't talk about, and W.E. Du Bois does a great job just cataloging this, is the residents of Tulsa are basically like refugees. They're given these badges, these identification badges. They have nothing, and they're just sent out of the town, right? So the whole community is demolished and burnt down. And there's violence, obviously, on both sides, but it's not... Right. The result is that the black community is devastated. Yeah. Yeah. And I think one could say it's because they had too much wealth and it was threatening. And there's this theory of, sort of minority, majority, a host culture. I can't remember the exact theory I had in the book, but basically, like, talk about immigrants like Chinese in Japan, or Jews in Germany, or other sort of successful minority groups in host countries, and how that during an economic depression that turns on you.
Yeah, and you suggest in the book that part of this is like minorities in host communities seem to be most successful or least hated. Yeah. I guess the term is probably better. When they go into fields of endeavor that the host community is less interested in pursuing. And it seemed like you told a similar story about some of the areas where African American entrepreneurs were most successful, like in the insurance business.
Absolutely. You find these niche markets. The biggest millionaires, in the black community made money in industries that whites just didn't touch, right? So one was funeral homes. Whites, Southerners would not touch black bodies, and so there's this booming industry in funeral homes. So, this idea that like blacks weren't entrepreneurs, like look at the places where there were markets and they were in it, right? Yeah. There's insurance. There was this big, I think I put it in the book, but this guy Hoffman or something writes this, statistical scientific thing for Prudential or MetLife or whatever, saying something like blacks as a race are going extinct, and so they should not be insured. Like, he has all these measurements, right? Like chest size and brain size, and like, it's not, he says, it's not malnourishment, it's not hard work, it's their race. So he talks about race traits. And so there are these insurance companies that are like, we're just not going to insure blacks. And so There you go, black insurance.
Well, and the other thing that struck me about that story that I thought was really interesting was the way you talked about the role of trust in insurance. And how critical it is to have trust between the customer and the insurance agent in order for the relationship to actually be a possibility.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with banks, right? You have to trust. You have to keep your deposits in. You have to keep paying your premiums. You need this long-term relationships. And so one of the ways in which racism erodes entrepreneurialism is trust, right? Like, and it's one of these soft things, right? But in order for a business to succeed, you have to give them some goodwill beyond just your money. And this is where racism undercuts. And this is where what's fascinating to me is when black banks fail, you have someone like Carter Woodson saying, the black community didn't trust our banks, and that's why we failed. We don't trust our... So there's this flagellation here, saying like we don't trust our own things, and there is data on this. Actually, even blacks considered at the time, and still probably do, considered white establishments more trustworthy or more, better products or whatever. And that again is a outgrowth of racism. I mean, it's the same thing with in other countries, right? I grew up in Iran, and everything, we call it Farangi, which is like foreign, was better. If it was foreign, it was like good. If it was Iranian, it was garbage. And most of the time it's true, right? Because we have this like corrupt, horrible market, but not all the things, right? Like fruit, like if you had like a banana from abroad, like that was going to taste better than one from home. And it's all the ways, or, just like whiteness, or, I mean, this is probably way tangential, but nose jobs, right? Everyone in Iran has a nose job, and they get these tiny little noses that are like, maybe someone in some like waspy Protestant town has those tiny noses, but no one in my part of the world has a natural nose like that. And it's, skin bleaching, blah, blah, blah. But it was a similar thing, like, maybe that's way off field, but coming back to that, it is this sense of like, the community and trust that eroded just the bottom line of these businesses. Forget all the other things that go with that. But the same with banks, the runs. And I don't think black banks were less trusted by their communities. And part of the reason they weren't is because a lot of these banks, especially pre-1920, was that the banks were part and parcel of the church and the fraternal society. And it was, your pastor on Sunday telling you to go invest. And Maggie Walker's bank is emblematic, right? She was... this women's group is like a secret society, and by secret society, that was just like their social groups. So those banks did a lot better than those that tried to go it alone.
Yeah. Well, you also suggest though that kind of social role of the banking also made it harder for them to be financially successful in the sort of traditional banking sense of maximizing returns on capital.
Totally. This was actually the most devastating part of reading some of these memoirs of black bankers, because for a black banker, you're wearing like 5 different hats. First of all, a lot of them come to banking from either, preaching, community activism, or like Jackie Robinson, right?
Those are all traditional backgrounds for bankers, right?
Right, right. Like they don't come into it to try to get money. They're coming into it because their community needs a bank, and like they should just do it, right? And so what you have is these banks then caught between like making good loans and giving loans to the people in their town that need it. And that's how the original insurance funds went bankrupt, is because they would do like an informal insurance fund for like the widows and all. And it was like, it was just the self-selection of like the poorest and the sickest. And you're not going to deny people burial rights and sickness. So all of the early black insurers went bankrupt because they were like serving the community. It wasn't profitable. And the black banks, it was the same thing. I mean, Jackie Robinson talks about this. Like he wants to serve the black community, and he feels like there's all these demands from community members saying, you need to give us this loan. You started this bank, and yet, the regulators are breathing down his neck. And reading his autobiography, which he wrote before he dies, sort of prematurely, I think the bank kills him. It's the stress of just keeping a bank profitable, meeting the needs of the community. And a lot of these bankers over time talk about this. Wesley Moran, who started Carver Bank in Manhattan also, he comes as a preacher, starts to own the bank. He's a preacher, civil rights, leader. And Martin Luther King was not unique in this way, right? Preacher, civil rights leader, and his wife is, banker. He's on the board of a bank. There were a lot of hats, and a lot of these men wore them.
Yeah. Well, so as you know, I have a long-standing interest in Richard Nixon.
Yeah, me too.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the fascinating Richard Nixon-oriented story you tell.
I feel like book. I need to ask you about your Richard Nixon fascination first.
So, but what I really, I hate to say liked because it's so gross, but the story you tell about how Richard Nixon sort of took black nationalism and rebranded it as black capitalism. And it's a huge story, but if you could give it in a nutshell, I mean, it's just such a paradigmatic.
In a nutshell, once I was in the archives of Nixon, I was like, this is the book I should have wrote. And as I'm finishing the book, I'm like, nothing is more interesting than this right here, right? And I wish, if I could write it again, I would just write chapter 6. And if you want to read the book, just read chapter 6. But black capitalism was essentially, Nixon's brilliant, right? There's these, the integrationist push, George Romney is like the representative of that, right? So we've got to integrate. You've got the Kerner Commission, Johnson's FHA, all of this push for integration. Nixon understands very clearly that he cannot force integration. And then there's the Black Power movement, right? There's, riots and violence. There's Black nationalism. There's the Black Panthers. This is like an insurrection, right? Horribly just terrifying to people, right? They've got guns. They're talking about linking up with Cuba and the communists. This is scary stuff. And they're asking for reparations. So what Nixon does is split the baby, literally cut the baby in half. No one gets the baby, right? And what he says is, fine, you want black power, I'll give you black power. You want, black control, I'll give you black control. But he doesn't actually mean it the way they meant it. So he co-opts this language of black power and says, yes, absolutely black power and black business. And so we're going to keep segregation because that seems to be what you're asking for. And just to back up, what they're asking for, what the black nationalists are asking for is sovereignty, right? So it really is a cross-colonial thing, right? They're in Cuba. They're saying anti-colonialization, give us sovereignty of the black ghetto. In other words, we want to control it. That's our land, right? Malcolm X says revolution's about land and there's going to be blood, right? So it's very violent. And he says, okay, you have black power, and so we're going to put some treasury deposits in black banks, and we're going to create this office of minority business enterprise and tell stories about successful black businesses and do affirmative action, which is his thing, right? Contract set-asides, all this stuff. And it's sort of this neutralizing thing, right? He takes the sting out of the Black Panthers. Meanwhile, the FBI is also hunting them down, right? So that's not just... The only thing he's doing is taking the rhetoric out, but he sort of cuts integration efforts off, exiles Romney to Mexico, right? And just kind of maneuvers this path. And so looping it back to the beginning, we're still talking about Nixon's black capitalism when we talk about entrepreneur zones. When Cory Booker comes out and says, these are emerging markets and win-win entrepreneur, blah, 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 right? Obama did this. Clinton went hard on this, right? So his whole lower middle income, tax credits, CDFI, community development, financial institutions, the microcredit, this is all based on black capitalism. They're not saying Nixon, but it was just really clever, and it gets you through that racial landmine, and it doesn't do anything. We've had 50 years of black capitalism, but no capital. And then you could tell the story, well, they're just lazy. They're not really being entrepreneurs. And that's bunk, right? There is no capital in black capitalism.
Yeah. Well, so I think that's the perfect way to kind of sum up the conversation, right? What you do in your book is kind of chronicle all of these sort of two-faced efforts at helping Black people succeed economically. But you suggest that there's sort of more fundamental problems or more fundamental things that need to be done. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think those are.
I mean, the fundamental things that need to be done is just a recognition of how much state engineering, how much government engineering went into the racial wealth gap, and how leaving it to the market is such a cop-out. You know, I'm not anti-market. I'm not one of these people who says and there is this growing movement that says capitalism is inherently racist. I don't think that. I just don't think we've ever had capitalism in America. You know, we've had so much state subsidies, and think of that what you will, it is what it is, right? You had the Homestead Act, you had the FHA, you had all of these credit mechanisms, and yet when you have Black communities saying, okay, we want this thing, then it's like, oh, well, capitalism. So you're using capitalism as a weapon, you know, and I think we just have to get real about what we do and what we don't do. And so the real reforms are pick your poison. I mean, you can choose integration. I think that's great. Or you can choose capital, like reparations. And that's great too. I mean, I'm an integrationist at heart, but I'm not about to tell people how to live their lives. Like, I do think there is something beautiful about the culture of a community. But it needs to be a community that's self-selected. It can't be one that is just segregated away. So you see this with other communities, right? Italians, Irish, the rest, Jews, you know, Asians to some extent. You come in and you can choose to assimilate or not. And to some extent, we haven't given that choice to Blacks. Maybe going forward we will, but you once you've got this, you know, this sort of geographical zone of poverty and exclusion, you can emerging market that all you want. It's not going to grow capital from a rock, right?
Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting that it seems to me people call it reparations because they don't want to call it redistribution.
Right. Yeah, sure. Call it whatever you want. I mean, you could call it like, you know, flowers. But like what it needs to be is a recognition of just what was taken away. Yeah. Not just taken away, but what was excluded, you know? I mean, the FHA, we talk about redlining, but like to really understand how that mortgage credit, depriving people of mortgage credit during those pivotal eras really was a intergenerational lack of wealth. I mean, and those decisions were made purely based on race. I mean, I've looked at some of these maps, like in Atlanta, I show my class, you've got side-by-side communities, one white, blue-collar, one Black business professionals, right by Morehouse and Spelman. And before the FHA bureaucrats come into town, those are roughly the same. The Black homes are going for pretty good money. And then the FHA decides just because, and they say, these are business professionals, this is the best, quote, best Negro area in the state, okay? Red zone, no credit, right? So once they make those decisions, that lasts a long time. I mean, those FHA maps were effective until the 60s. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, thanks so much, Mehrsa.
Thank you, Brian.
This is a great conversation.
This is fun. Yeah.
Richard Nixon speaks on black capitalism.
It's no longer enough that white-owned enterprises employ greater number of Negroes, whether as laborers or middle management personnel. This is needed, but it has to be accompanied by an expansion of black ownership, of black capitalism. We need more black employers, more black businesses. Integration must come, but in order for it to come on a sound and equal basis, the black community has to be built from within, even as the old barriers between black and white are dismantled from without. We have to get private enterprise into the ghetto, but at the same time, we have to get the people of the ghetto into private enterprise as workers, as managers, as owners. These past few years have been a long night of the American spirit. It's time we let in the sun. It's time to move past the old civil rights and to bridge the gap between freedom and dignity, between promise and fulfillment.
The preceding pre-recorded political announcement was paid for by the Michigan-Nixon Agnew Committee.